The readings today have a very clear center. They're about prophecy. And so I want to begin this homily with a few words from the Second Vatican Council, that super important event in the Catholic Church last century, whose interpretation is still something that drives the Church forward today. At the Second Vatican Council, 3,000 bishops from around the world insisted that prophecy was part of the vocation of every member of the Church, both lay and clergy, though in different ways. I'm going to quote now from the council. It says that Christ, the great prophet, who proclaimed the kingdom of his Father both by the testimony of his life and the power of his words, continually fulfills his prophetic office until the complete manifestation of glory. He does this not only through the hierarchy who teach in his name and with his authority, but also through the laity, whom he made his witnesses and to whom he gave understanding of the faith and an attractiveness in speech, so that the power of the gospel might shine forth in their daily social and family life. From the hierarchy or from the clergy, you can expect or should expect faithful preaching, the preaching of the Word of God, which is living and effective, cutting into our hearts, convicting us in our own day-to-day of the path of conversion and the way in which to live more fully the life of the gospel. And you can expect also from the prophetic office of the hierarchy or the clergy, the faithful celebration of the sacraments, such that Christ's desire to remain with us sacramentally, that is really personally, presently in his body, is made effective, and that we can be united to him not by mere metaphor or figure, but in truth. And then for the laity, for your part, you have the glorious task of sanctifying the world by your unique insight into the faith, specialized as you all are in so many domains of the world. And then by the attractiveness of speech, the council says, that as you labor to more effectively take the gospel and permeate every corner of society with it, you also know how that society will receive it. You are expert in so many aspects, family life, every profession, and you know how to bridge the gap that there is between the gospel and the world that awaits for it. Reading again from the council, let the laity not then hide this hope in the depths of their hearts, but even in the program of their secular life, let them express it by a continual conversion and by wrestling against the world rulers of this darkness, against the spiritual forces of wickedness. Prophecy is exciting work. Admittedly, it can be daunting. Admittedly, it leads us to lose our lives for the sake of Jesus, as St. Peter learns through today's gospel. But it is exciting work because it's an implication of God's desire to reconcile the whole world to himself. And it's an expression of the fact that every aspect of our lives is destined for an eternal meaning in the life of his Son. There is no task too mundane for Jesus, who wants to rescue the mundus, the world. Whether it's a little child doing his or her homework, or whether it's a family member doing some mundane domestic chore, cleaning the bathroom, or whether it's some husband or wife going into the world to work in whatever profession, God wants it all. He created the world and sent his Son to turn it into a kingdom that reflects the glory of their love. We are that world that God wants to transform into an expression of his eternal love. There is no aspect of our lives that he does not want. There's no aspect that we are not called, like prophets, to permeate with the gospel and to offer here on the altar. So what can we learn from our readings today about prophecy? I think from the first reading in Jeremiah, we learn that it's an inner need. Those of us who are caught up in the love affair with God, who can understand something of what Jeremiah means when he says, "You duped me, Lord," or "You seduced me, Lord, and I let myself be seduced," who understand, I suspect, something of the way romance works. where there's this aspect that we're sort of drawn on by a power outside of ourselves, and yet we have consented to it, where we fall in love as if it were not our own design, and yet what we've fallen into is love and something we have consented to with our whole heart. Jeremiah knows what it's like to feel intimacy with God, to love his word, and thus be unable to hold it in. He grows weary holding it in. When we are living our prophetic vocation, we will understand that. We will long to express it in every corner of our family and social lives. In the second reading, we learn from St. Paul what we also see in Jeremiah, that oftentimes this prophetic call leads us to chafe against the world. Jeremiah says that there's a certain kind of violence it leads him toward. Obviously, we're not talking about physical violence or an aggression or bitterness, which sadly we see sometimes in the world. But we are talking about a readiness to chafe against the world, to contradict, and to do so boldly. St. Paul urges us, do not conform yourself to this age, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, so that you may know what is God's will, that you may discern what is pleasing and perfect. And in the gospel today, St. Peter learns what it means to be a prophet. Because oftentimes, if we get what St. Paul is saying, where we know we cannot conform ourselves to this world, but we must boldly preach the truth of God and sometimes chafe against it, we can sometimes be led to rail a bit, to be too aggressive, to lose sight of the fact that we too are part of what must convert, and thus be surprised when we suffer, be surprised when the world resists us, be surprised that following in the footsteps of Christ, of letting him carry his prophetic mission in our lives, leads us to the cross. Let us be true prophets, and thus not like St. Peter, scandalized when we find that letting forth the inner need leads us into conflict. Let us be prepared to suffer with the love and docility of Christ in those moments, not to rail, but to endure in love. True prophets are aware of their own need to convert, and thus their solidarity with even the worst of sinners. True prophets know that what God has come to do is reconcile the world, and thus they're not surprised when they see it is in need of being reconciled. True prophets are ready to be uncomfortable, to stay on the cross. To say a little more about true prophecy, I want to say something about false prophecy as well. Earlier in his book, Jeremiah speaks about false prophets who say, peace, peace, when there is no peace. Priests and prophets who, in order to avoid the necessary conflict we have with a world whose mind we do not share because we share the mind of Christ, and thus want at great cost to be quiet, to pretend as if things are okay, to avoid whatever, when we're honest, we know is not, and thus say peace, peace, when we know there's no peace, when we see the injustice before us that God is calling us to strive against. Such prophets ignore the hard work of conversion, interiorly and in the world around us. They avoid the uncomfortable task of staying on the cross with Jesus Christ, to let God work through him and us to bring the world through its labor pains, to prepare it to become what God has in mind. Now, some say we suffer from this temptation to false prophecy of crying, peace, peace, when there is no peace, in a particular way today. Some say that we live in unprecedented times. To be honest, we live in our times, and it seems to me that probably every age had that sense of things being unprecedented or uniquely difficult. And I suspect that makes sense. On the one hand, we shouldn't claim to have this divine cosmic vision where we can sort of compare all times perfectly and thus find in our moment the unique catastrophe that all things are heading toward. But we should, I think, like every generation, appreciate the fact that we will see something acute about our own day because we're living in our own day. And we are rightly, uniquely sensitive to the challenges of our day and the ways in which we are urgently being called to prophesy. One person who thinks we're living in a very particular age is a Protestant author named Eric Metaxas. He's a very famous author because he studied Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a Lutheran pastor who resisted Nazism and came to his death. Metaxas thinks that the church today parallels in some ways the church in Germany in the 1930s. It's a dramatic thesis, one worth wrestling with, whether one agrees or disagrees with different aspects of his claim. His point is that there are dramatic ideological currents which are coming to a social, political, economic power in our day through, in part, the weakness of Christians to stand against them. And just like in 1930s Germany, so too perhaps today, those forces are working towards something far more awful than we can imagine. Metaxas is looking, when he gets specific, at things that are probably very familiar to us, ideological powers like abortion, euthanasia, all the various sexual dysfunctions, from pornography to transgenderism. But he's insisting that these things, which sadly are relatively familiar to us, are in some sense new, and he wants us to be aware of what's new about them. And in particular, he wants pastors to be aware. He's writing his book, at least first, to pastors of the evangelical church. And by extension, we Catholics can hear the challenge and measure ourselves against it as well. Because in Metaxas' experience, Christians have the sense that there's something different about our time, and they want their pastors to acknowledge it. He writes, they're looking to their pastoral leaders to acknowledge this newness, to help them understand what is happening in the light of the gospel, and to lead them in standing against it. If I understand rightly, what I think he is pointing out, again, is the way in which ideology is starting to grab power. And it's starting to grab power because we are either apathetic or we haven't become informed. To be concrete, we could think of the ways in which the ideology of euthanasia, once just a really awful idea, has now become a business. There's a Swiss business which is selling instruments through which people can end their lives. Or we could think of the hypersexualization, which used to be a strange idea of some philosophers in university ivory towers, that is now permeating things like Disney. We could think of what happened last month, where the European Court of Human Rights doubled down on its effort to force Romania to redefine its understanding of marriage. Or we could think of what happened last month in Mexico, when a former congressman and Catholic pro-life leader was condemned for gender-based political violence simply for referring to a transgender identifying person as a man who self-ascribes as a woman. This pro-life leader now must pay a fine. He must publish on a social media account for 30 days in succession a court-written apology, must submit to a re-education course, and accept that his name is listed now in a national registry of offenders. Or we could think of what happened last month in our own country in Massachusetts, when a Catholic couple was denied the chance to adopt a child explicitly because of their Catholic faith, and in particular what their Catholic faith says about our sexuality. We could also think of the newness insofar as we are in various ways at risk of supporting these things, even in ways we may not pay attention to. We could think about our choices, our economic choices, what we consume. We might, on the one hand, become very indignant about some of the things I've said, at the hypersexualization and violence is going through our culture. And yet, what choices do we make when we turn on the television? Do we have the strength to turn off what we know we don't need, what is not healthy physically and mentally? and choose a new habit. Or we could think about our own investment practices. One of the things that does seem unique to our age is the ways in which our financial instruments can hide what we concretely support with our money. These abstract aggregates that we use to manage risk, who knows what we're supporting? One day we'll find out, when all things are laid bare, what the abstractions of our financial markets have brought about in concrete. If you're uncomfortable, so am I. There are so many things we could say. Catholic social teaching embraces every aspect of our life: the economy, environment, family life, politics, you name it. And we could go on like this, but I think we don't need to. I'm already sufficiently uncomfortable, and I imagine many of you are. Moreover, we shouldn't stop here. This is a homily, not a rally. And what we need to do is frame this challenge in the light of the faith. Because at the end of the day, this is exciting. We should not cry, woe is me. We should not, like St. Peter, say, no suffering. We should not be scandalized at the challenge we face in our time like any other, to live our prophetic call, to work in the world, to preach as best I can faithfully, and to take the gospel, living and effective as it is, into your lives. Sanctify the world and bring it back next Sunday and every Sunday here to the altar, so that the Son may gather it into the kingdom that he is building and present it for the glory of the Father. I'll close with just a few final comments on prophecy. The exhortation is to stay on the cross. Discover the tension in your conscience that is the cross. If you are fully self-assured, then you are at risk of, like Peter, trying to pull Jesus down off the cross. Only if you are wrestling with your own need to convert and the difficulty of helping your surroundings to convert will you know what the drama of conscience is like. The search for his living word. How today, Father? How with this person? How in this profession? Don't give up and run away. Don't close your eyes to the tension. Stay open to it. Like the good servant, use your talents. Don't bury them away because you are afraid of our demanding master. Christian life is being duped into a dream that we cannot guarantee for ourselves. It is the dream of the reconciliation of the whole world to God. Let's recognize how high our task is and how far it outstrips our powers, such that we could be at peace when we encounter the obvious fact that sometimes it feels overwhelming. But then recognize it was never our dream from the beginning, it was God's dream from the beginning that he wants to achieve in us. And so when you feel overwhelmed, feel more deeply his presence. It's in those moments that he wants to underwrite your efforts and make them effective. And finally, we all have friends and family who think differently than we do. Let's accept once again to stay on the cross of our conscience. Embrace those friends and family. Embrace them because they push us all out of our self-assurance. They push us all, no matter where we stand on various issues, to rack our conscience, to measure our thoughts and actions against the fullness of the gospel. Thanks be to God for those who challenge us. Remember the prophet Jonah. God sent Jonah not to Israel, but to the Assyrians, to Nineveh, the enemies of Israel, to those who would destroy Israel and scatter her across the land. And when Jonah is bitter that God would send him to prophesy to those who were his enemies, God tells Jonah, there are 120,000 people in Nineveh who do not know their left hand from their right, not to mention the animals. In other words, how can God be indifferent to those who are around us, who play the role of the Ninevites in our day? Let us go to those with whom we are in conflict, with a desire to love them, to allow ourselves to be challenged by them. Let us not rail or with indignation express how weary we are, how much we rely upon ourselves, how much we secretly doubt God's action in our history. Let us move from the boldness of those with inner conviction that God is present among us, wanting to ennoble our lives, and that even if we lose our life and appear on the surface of the world to be unsuccessful, if we lose our lives for Jesus Christ, we'll find them. And in that intimacy, let us find our every energy